How many of us have ever played Dungeons and Dragons? A fair number. How many have played any kind of role-playing game? About the same number. How many have never played Dungeons and Dragons? A few more. Excellent. So as you've just heard, Dungeons and Dragons is a role-playing game in a fantasy setting. It's like J.R.R. Tolkien or King Arthur, all that swords and sorcery kind of stuff. A role-playing game, which I may sometimes just refer to as an RPG. A role-playing game is where the players are acting or doing improv around the table. A group of friends each pretends to be a character, they play a role, and they go on an adventure together. Usually one person will serve as dungeon master or game master, who creates the world where the group is adventuring and offers them a series of choices or predicaments to engage or avoid or figure out or overcome somehow. Especially in D&D, Dungeons and Dragons, the outcome of the player's choices are partially determined by rolling dice. So you might hear a dungeon master ask a player to roll a die to see if they are able to sneak past that sleeping guard. Players also use dice to create an important aspect of their character, strength, intelligence, dexterity, etc. And again, the game master might say something like, okay, roll to see if you can leap from rock to rock all the way across the river. If your dexterity is higher than 14, you can add 2 to your roll. DMs and players use dice and their imaginations to have adventures and tell a story together. They can also use maps and maybe little figurines to help show who's doing what where and who can attack who where. Others don't use maps or figurines, but it's all just played out in the theater of the mind. Now, there are many, many, many kinds of role-playing games beyond Dungeons and Dragons. Some RPGs offer similar fantasy settings. Others are played in space. Sometimes they're in the Wild West. There are also horror scenarios. I once played an early 20th century vampire hunter through a few games. There is a huge variety of RPGs. If you go to drivethrurpg.com, just in the new titles section alone, there is SPQR, which is about ancient Rome, Modern Warfare, Apocalypse, Ancient Aliens, Divine Menagerie, which is these incredible monsters, Dungeon Delve, Sidekick, which looks like superheroes, Mummy, and Contagion. Why anyone would want to play Contagion while we're all playing Contagion IRL, I don't know, but it's there. I've got my eye on a role-playing game called Red Carnations on a Black Grave, in which participants play the roles of French rebels in the ill-fated Paris Commune of 1871. It's a niche, but boy is it cool. The point is, if you want to collaborate on a story, there's probably a system that will provide the bones for you to have an adventure. And it doesn't even have to be collaborative. There are role-playing games for single, solo adventures. Tim Hutchings created 1,000-Year-Old Vampire a few years ago. It's a remarkable game in which you play a vampire who outlives all of their loved ones and all of their acquaintances, and eventually outlives even their own memories of those they used to love or who they used to be. It asks fascinating questions about memory and identity and how those interplay. There's also a solo role-playing game called Long Haul 1983, and they describe it this way. You play a long-haul truck driver trying to make their way home. Every day you'll hit the road, navigating treacherous highways, fleeing from menacing threats, and dealing with the psychological impacts of isolation. And at the end of the day, you'll find a payphone, make a call, and leave a message for the most important person in your life. They never pick up. You never stop calling. Using a deck of cards, a few dice, and a microphone, players will create an original narrative of resilience in the face of world-shifting catastrophe. I presume that Sean Patrick Kane came up with this game to help himself find some resilience in the face of the world-shifting catastrophe that has been the pandemic. I think that's why the game is also completely sold out. The RPG world is a little like beer companies. There are millions of people who brew small batches on their own. There are lots of folks who do it well enough to have a little brew pub and get a steady following, and there are a few giant companies who sell truckloads and shiploads. Dungeons and Dragons is the shipload in this analogy, by far the most widely played RPG and the most widely known brand name. That may partially be due to the satanic panic of the 1880s and 90s. Starting in 1980, over 10,000 unsubstantiated cases of satanic ritual abuse came to light and were reported in breathless tones, and rock and roll music and Dungeons and Dragons got caught up in the hysteria. Lots of kids saw their adventure books and character sheets and their maps and their dice thrown away because some local kid's paranoid parent heard him talking about casting spells and got concerned and demanded the school board do something. You may have also heard about D&D because some kids wanted to have their very own actual live action experience and made it in the TV news when at least one of them went to the emergency room because stumbling around in the dark in a basement in the suburbs with fake magic wands and not so fake swords can be a problem. If you're wondering, yes, my group did have a LARP, a live action role play, in my suburban basement, but nobody got hurt, and we all realized it's more fun to sit around the table anyway. Now, I don't want to give LARPing a bad name. There are lots of different LARPs in the world and sort of fuzzy boundaries here. Live action role play can be everything from doing a little role-playing game around a board game, such as, I say, Jeffrey, the whiskey you serve on this train seems to have been watered down to nothing. As soon as we reach Chicago, I dare say I will build a rival railroad and bankrupt your New York Central. So, board games with bad accents. All the way up to official LARPs played by universities and corporations and the Pentagon to train their future leaders. So, LARPing isn't all just people in their basement getting hurt. And one last expansion of this concept is we've been talking that dungeon masters and game masters and dice, and I could go on and on about the dice. Oh, so good dice. Not all role-playing games have game masters and dice. There are GM-less RPGs, there are diceless RPGs. They require a lot more improv, a lot more creativity in the moment, but they can be really super cool. Avery Alder's The Quiet Year is one I would recommend here. So that's the what that Dungeons and Dragons and role-playing games are. Now let's talk about the why. Why do I recommend people play Dungeons and Dragons? They're fun, and it's an inexpensive way to have fun. With pencil and paper, you can do all kinds of great things. Now, you can spend as much money as you want in role-playing games. Yes, we are in America after all, but you can also do it hours and hours of fun for very little money, and you're hanging out with your friends. What a good thing. And it can be therapeutic, as the New York Times article said. Play is therapeutic. Now, 100 years ago, when I was in junior high, I was pretty nerdy. I know that's hard to believe. I was bullied a little. And in the Story for All Ages, we heard about a boy named Ivan who wanted to stay here at his mother's house rather than there at his father's new house. In my childhood, there was also a mom's house and a dad's house, and I wasn't super happy at either of them. In the story, Ivan wanted to be here but not there. In my life, I really didn't care about here or there. I wanted elsewhere. And Dungeons and Dragons is a fantastic elsewhere. Probably similar for others. The people in our group, Dave's dad let him know that he considered him weak and soft every chance he got. Dave's character was a tough fighter. Mark was scrawny and super socially awkward. His character was a magic user who had almost no physical strength, but whose intelligence could make amazing things happen at a distance. And I played a cleric. And we heard it's almost a cliche among LGBTQ plus players of D&D and role-playing games. Games are glamorous games, I guess. A lot of people played non-straight or transgender characters before they actually came out in the real world. As Ms. Diamond reported in the Times article, many players described using Dungeons and Dragons to safely explore facets of their personality and their identity. By now, I've played dozens or maybe even hundreds of characters. In the game that a number of UU clergy are beginning right now, my character is a tiny fairy with dragonfly wings who throws bombs at their establishment enemies. Their name is Anti-Fae. Antifa, aren't I clever? Anti-fascists. Anti-Fae is the slightly singed plague doctor who is quite different from that good cleric that I started 45 years ago and only wanted to help and heal people. Now, be clear, I cannot imagine throwing bombs myself, but I think it will be interesting to play a character who does. I wonder how they justify it to themselves. I wonder if they'll grow out of it as they connect with these other characters and have these adventures. RPGs are therapeutic, and they can also be therapeutic in that they allow us to be something larger than ourselves. That deep need for humans to find community, right? Telling stories together, as I mentioned, Mary Wollstonecraft, Shelley, all the way up to Dungeons and Dragons players now. Telling stories with powerful emotional resonance in the game and in real life is a joy. And sometimes these stories are so powerful and so well acted, so well role played, that one doesn't have to be playing to have that sort of experience. Critical Role is a number of people who play Dungeons and Dragons online every week, and they've got millions of people who follow them. They call themselves a bunch of nerdy voice actors, sit around and play Dungeons and Dragons. Every week, when we've watched the episode, a friend and I call each other and talk about the latest happens and what we think is going to happen next, and it's super exciting and super fun to be together, even though we're hundreds of miles away. The Critical Role people are masters at their craft, and when their characters die or almost die, or they lose someone they love, literally tens of thousands of people are tearing up along with them. One of the Critical Role stars is Liam O'Brien. Liam plays Caleb Widogast, whose tragic backstory includes a teacher who manipulates Caleb into killing his own parents. At the beginning of the campaign, having just recently done that, Caleb is a self-loathing, filthy wreck. 2 years and 140 episodes later, Caleb has faced his abusers and himself and become a moral center for the group. Part of Caleb's healing came when a trusted friend helped him understand that you are not born with venom in your veins. And that will come up in this video, which we're going to see here. Please do stop recording the sermon at this point, and we will listen to Liam O'Brien at a panel at San Diego's Comic-Con this year. So Liam will answer a question from a fan about Caleb Widogast.
Thank you. Hello.
Hi, my name's Kat, and first of all, I just want to thank all of you. This is such a surreal experience, especially because recently I just got a Caleb Widogast-inspired sentiment against self-harm tattoo with the quote, "You were not born with venom in your veins," and it's just this whole world that you all have invented means so much to me, and my question is for Liam. When it comes to Caleb, his past and his trauma, as someone who is diagnosed with CPTSD, what thought processes and ideas went into how Caleb would react to his trauma when faced with it? Because a lot of media uses PTSD as just, oh, flashbacks, but you guys did so much more with Caleb, and so that is my question.
Well, Caleb is largely grounded in parts of my life that are private, but very real. You know, I know that we all aspire to sort of rise from the ashes, and we do, but I know from experience that when things happen to us, on some level we carry them with us. And you know, when I created Caleb, I knew he was going to be a wizard. I knew that they were going to fight dragons. I knew that fantastical things were going to happen. But when I created him, it was to explore, you know, the human experience. And I didn't think anyone would ever. I always wondered if anyone would directly ask me this. The best way to answer this in a crowd full of people is to say that I'm happy that I got to use the story we told of the Mighty Nine with Caleb, that people are really flawed, all of us, but it doesn't mean that every one of us is able to achieve great things, regardless of what's happened to us in the past. Doesn't mean we forget them. It doesn't mean that they go away. We live with them. But the world is still there for every single one of us. And it's a beautiful tattoo.
Thank you, Joseph. Let's record again. So clearly Dungeons and Dragons games have an emotional resonance for lots and lots of people, and it brings the New York Times article talked about bleed from the game into reality. There's also bleed from reality into the game. That's how we learn and grow, with these immense emotional echoes, right? And so, because of that power of emotion and storytelling, it's not surprising that many teaching and helping professions would find ways to harness the power of role-playing games in their jobs. A friend and a colleague who is the world's first game minister offers D&D games for staff retreats. Now, I've been to a lot of staff retreats and a lot of team building sessions in my life. I have heard things about communication styles using grids and graphs and colors. I have taken the Myers-Briggs typology over and over again. We've done the Enneagram a number of times here recently. Learning about who we are in the world and how we might work together by playing Dungeons and Dragons? Now that's a retreat I want to go to. And because it's less academic and it's more about play and fun, I think people will embrace it more and be more open and may learn more from it. One of the things that I was surprised is how popular Dungeons and Dragons is in prisons. I guess I shouldn't have been surprised. Stress relief, it helps you get out your aggressions. You can work on your identity issues in a confined, contained way. Of course that's a good idea for prisons. Now, the Unitarian Universalist Association has a partner institution, the Church of the Larger Fellowship, where there are members from all over the world. They offer a prisoner outreach program, and the games minister I just talked about is putting together a proposal to get D&D games out to all of those prisoners to make it really easy. You know, the easy part is to roll a character and to talk about killing dragons or coming up, what are you going to do to the bartender who lied to you? But getting that script and the story itself is the hard part, and he's going to write the scripts and give them out to lots of people all over the country. I think it's a great idea. And therapists and counselors have been using role-playing games to help humans thrive and adapt and evolve. At Kotaku.com a few years ago, Cecilia D'Anastasio wrote, "Therapists have long used role play, inviting patients to role play their personal scenarios from their partners or their parents' perspectives. But buying into that can be hard sometimes without a good hook or a fictional world's distance from real life. Because D&D is inherently cooperative and escapist, it urges players to reimagine the ways they interact with their peers. And because each player has their own specialty, like communicating with dragons, they'll each have their moment to feel valuable in a group setting. These therapists are trained to take it slow and use great intentionality, and it can work with wonders." Here's a story about an autistic child from that same article. Anastasio continues, "A parent of an autistic child told me that among peers, her son has trouble deviating from his own ideas of what's right. D&D forces players to consider others' strategies to avoid sleeping orcs or to use their high charisma score to negotiate with enemies. He's actually told me he's disagreed sometimes with what his fellow adventurers have decided, and that later sometimes he's come around and agreed that the decision turned out okay." She added that this is a startling increase in flexibility for him. D&D can help people grow. Similar approaches are being developed for accessibility considerations, such as hearing difficulties, blindness, anxiety disorders, aphantasia, which is social skill development in those who have developmentally delay or developmental impairment, attention deficit hyperactivity disorder, have to sit around a table and take turns, blindness, agoraphobia in people with muscular dystrophy, cerebral palsy, cognitive decline associated with aging, and the list goes on and on. We're only in the C's right now. Now, there is an essential caveat I should point out. This does require training and transparency. Now, we just heard about someone who used a high charisma skill to negotiate with people and to encourage them to do what they wanted them to do. I have been told a story about a 9-year-old girl who was playing. She was very shy, very responsible little girl, sort of a wallflower, and the character she rolled up had this high charisma score. And when the time came for the group turning to her and said, "Go negotiate with that person, go convince someone to do this," that was so out of character for her, she was unable to do it, and it was more and more uncomfortable for her, and eventually she quit playing. Rather than being encouraged to test new identities and capacities, she was sort of forced into it. So it takes a little bit of intentionality and someone who's trained to do these things. And the final caveat here is that DMs are human and fallible, and some of them are abusive and can be predatory. Good DMs will offer a session 0 to talk about what it is that players do and do not want in their game. And it involves questions like, do you want a little bit of romance in the game? Do you want sex in the game? Yes, no? Are you okay with sex between players in the game? Do you want to see torture? Do you want to see harm to animals? Is it okay if there's a little homophobia in the game? Genocide in the game? How do you feel about spiders? It's important to have these conversations, and so when you're playing later on, you can be sufficiently challenged to grow without being so far shut down that you can't. Transparent, trained DMs with good support structures can make role-playing games truly pastoral care, in my opinion. Dungeons and Dragons was created almost 50 years ago in Wisconsin, a bunch of Midwestern white boys who would not let girls play, and who made the dark-skinned elves the evil ones. Now played by millions of people of all genders, sexes, races, ethnicities, ages, abilities, to have fun, to feel part of something larger than themselves, and to level up as human beings. Whatever practice we do, whether it's reading or exercising or parenting or going to therapy or playing a role-playing game, working on our own personal evolution is important, and it's good to support each other in that quest. Another good D&D word. It's also the fourth principle of our Unitarian Universal Association, supporting each other in our growth. So may we be. And if you want to play a game sometime, you know my email and my phone number is in that little piece of paper there. Let's do this. That's not pathetic, right? That's just being offering things. Speaking of offerings,